The fall feasts have not yet been fulfilled. The Bible teaches in Matthew 13, it says, the harvest is the end of the world. And it uses the symbolism of a harvest for the end of the world. So basically the fall feasts or the harvest feasts or the autumn feasts are going to be fulfilled at what the Bible calls the end of the world. Which the Bible, when it talks about Jesus Christ coming in the clouds with great power and glory in Matthew 24, you know, the Bible refers to that as the end of the world. At the beginning of Matthew 24, Mark 13, etc. So, Jesus Christ fulfilled all the spring feasts at His first coming. He's going to fulfill all the harvest feasts at His second coming, or the end of the world. Now, how is He going to fulfill these feasts? Well, let's look at what these fall feasts are. Look down, if you would, at verse 24 in Leviticus 23 there. He said, on the first day of the 7th month is the blowing of the trumpets. On the 10th day of the 7th month is the Day of Atonement. Then a little further down, he talks about the 15th day of the 7th month being the Feast of Tabernacles. So we have 3 feasts that Jesus is going to fulfill on His second coming. How is He going to fulfill them? Well, here's what's interesting. That first fall feast, the blowing of the trumpets, did you notice how it occurs right smack dab in the middle of the year? Think about it. The first day of the 7th month. What does that mean? Well, the first day of the 7th month, that means that there's been 6 months leading up to it, and you got 6 months to go. So the first day of the 7th month is right dead center of the year, and it's the blowing of the trumpets. Then 10 days later, you have the Day of Atonement. Then after that, you have the Feast of Tabernacles. So stop and think about this. What does the blowing of the trumpets represent when it comes to the second coming of Jesus Christ? Now, many people will jump in and say, oh, that's the rapture. And I've heard a lot of people teach that. But in fact, the blowing of the trumpets does not represent the rapture. Neither is the blowing of trumpets the last trump, because of the fact that another trumpet is blown on the 10th day of the 7th month on the Day of Atonement. The blowing of the trumpets, what that represents is not the trumpet sounding at the rapture, but rather it refers to an alarm sounding. You see, when the Bible would talk about blowing of trumpets in the Old Testament, it often had to do with sounding an alarm because an enemy was attacking them, and they would blow with the trumpet so that God would save them. Let me read it for you from Numbers 10. You don't have to turn there. Listen to Numbers 10:9. And if you go to war in your land against the enemy that oppress you, then ye shall blow an alarm with the trumpets, and ye shall be remembered before the Lord your God, and ye shall be saved from your enemies. So the Bible says when there's an enemy that's coming to oppress you, you're supposed to blow with the trumpets, and God's going to save you out of the hand of your enemies. He also talked about it in Numbers 31:6 when he referred to, going to war and blowing with the trumpets. Stop and think about this. When it comes to end times Bible prophecy, we know that the book of Revelation deals in great detail with a certain 7-year period of time. Now, this entire period of time, often called Daniel's 70th week, in the middle of the 7-year period that Revelation describes, there's what's called the abomination of desolation. I'm going to hurry up and just quickly explain this. This is where the Antichrist sets up an image, the false prophet sets up an image of the Antichrist, and people have to worship the Antichrist. And the Bible says that when this takes place, and this is all covered in Revelation 13, that the Antichrist will make war with the saints and overcome them. So, again, in the midst of the week, the Antichrist makes war with the saints and overcomes them. That is at the time of the abomination of desolation. Well, wait a minute. Remember what feast took place right in the dead center of the year? The blowing of the trumpets. What do trumpets represent in that passage? They represent the blowing of an alarm of an oppressive enemy. What happens in the dead center of Daniel's 70th week, or the 7-year period that most of the events in Revelation fall within? What happens? The Antichrist makes war with the saints. He is the oppressive enemy. And the blowing of the trumpets is symbolic of the warning sound of the alarm that we are going to be persecuted by the Antichrist, that he's going to make war against the saints and overcome them. So the blowing of the trumpets basically represents, in biblical prophecy, the abomination of desolation and the Antichrist's war against the saints. And look, that's when the great tribulation begins, is it not? Because Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation, That's in the middle of the 7 years. He says, then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no nor ever shall be. Remember, first day of the 7th month, middle of the year, blowing of the trumpets represents the abomination of desolation. 10th day of the 7th month, there's a trumpet that sounds that represents the trumpet of the rapture. That trumpet is called the trumpet of Jubilee, and it is blown on the Day of Atonement, on the 10th day of the 7th month, only once every 50 years. Let's look at that briefly here. Leviticus 25:9. Then shalt thou cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. Notice, 10 days after, right? Because look, he says, the 10th day of the 7th month, in the Day of Atonement, shall ye make the trumpet sound throughout all your land. And ye shall hallow the 50th year. And watch what the Bible says about the trumpet of Jubilee. He says, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. It shall be a jubilee unto you, and ye shall return every man unto his possession, and ye shall return every man unto his family. The first feast was the blowing of the trumpets, representing the Antichrist making war with the saints, beginning with the abomination of desolation. The next fall feast, or end of the world harvest feast, is the 10th day of the 7th month, which is the Day of Atonement, but it's also the day of the blowing of the trumpet of Jubilee. What is that which characterizes the Day of Jubilee, or the trumpet of the Jubilee? He said it was proclaiming liberty throughout the land, and that basically every man would return to his possession and his inheritance. Look at Romans 8, and notice what the Bible says about the resurrection, or the rapture, the first resurrection. Look at Romans chapter 8, beginning in verse 21. You're going to find some of the same wording that we saw with the Jubilee. It says in verse 21, because the creature itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now. Watch this, verse 23. And not only they, but ourselves also, which have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting for the adoption, to wit, the redemption of our body. So right now he says our soul is saved, but our body's not going to be saved, of course, until the resurrection, the first resurrection, or what we commonly call the rapture, when in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, we shall be changed. This mortal shall put on immortality. This corruptible shall put on incorruption. And the Bible says we will be brought from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God when our body is redeemed, when our body is resurrected. You see, at the rapture, that is called the glorious liberty of the children of God. So doesn't it make sense that in the fall end of the world feasts, the trumpet of the Jubilee proclaiming liberty represents the trumpet sounding when the dead in Christ are raised incorruptible? 1 Corinthians 15:51. And notice also, it's the last feast trump of that series of feasts. You know, when he goes through these feasts. The last trump there is the trumpet of Jubilee. Last among what series? Well, we already had the blowing of trumpets on the first day of the 7th month. Then there's one more trumpet that's blown, 10th day of the 7th month. What's interesting about that is the space between those two events, right? Because blowing of trumpets on the first day, on the 10th day of the 7th month is the trumpet of Jubilee sounding, which is symbolic of the trumpet that's going to sound on the day of the resurrection or the rapture. So, if the war with the saints, or the great tribulation mentioned in Matthew 24, begins at the abomination of desolation at the midpoint of the week, and then obviously our persecution and trials and tribulations are over when the rapture happens because we're caught up to be with Christ, then what period of time is that great tribulation going to encompass? Well, symbolically, when we look at these feasts, we have 10 days right there, which matches up perfectly with Revelation 2:10. You shall have tribulation 10 days. Which 10 days? From the first day of the 7th month to the 10th day inclusively, that's your 10 days of tribulation. Now, but let me say this. The great tribulation that the Bible mentions in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and elsewhere will last for more than 10 days. I'm not saying it's only 10 days. Because I believe that the Great Tribulation will last 75 days if you study this out and understand it. But the 10 days is symbolic of the first day of the 7th month to the 10th day of the 7th month of these feast days. Okay. And again, it's a lot to go into. It's a lot to wrap your mind around. But when you study this, it just becomes amazing how everything lines up. I mean, it'll blow your mind. Like, for example, since we're talking about a 7-year period of Daniel's 70th week, and we're talking about in the dead center, the abomination of desolation, and then we're talking about shortly thereafter, the tribulation being cut short by Jesus Christ coming in the clouds and the trumpet sounding, sometime during the second half of Daniel's 70th week. When you look at it that way, and then you compare it to the Hebrew calendar year, and you overlay the Hebrew calendar year with the 7 years of Daniel's 70th week, which I've done on a chart, if you overlay that, you see that the blowing of the trumpets lines up perfectly with the abomination of desolation, right in the middle. But then you'll also see that if you line up trumpet of the Jubilee with the 7-year period of Daniel's 70th week, you'll notice that 1,335 days in to Daniel's 70th week would line up perfectly. Well, in Daniel chapter 12, the Bible says, blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1,305 and 30 days. And he basically says that Daniel's going to be resurrected at the end of that 1,335 days. So, you know, that all just lines up perfectly, because if you take 1,335, divide it by 7, you end up with 190. Well, what's the 190th day of the year? The 10th day of the 7th month. And so either you think that that's really cool right now, or you have no idea what I just said.